The year is 1553. In a stone cell at the Tower of London, a girl counts the sunrises she has left. Not in years, not in months. In days, she is 17 years old. Her name is Lady Jane Grey, and 77 days ago, she was Queen of England. Now, she is a prisoner waiting to die. But death, when it finally comes, will be a mercy compared to what they do to her first. Because what happened to Jane in those 11 weeks between her arrest and her execution wasn't just imprisonment. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological destruction designed to break not just her body, but her soul. And here's what makes it unbearable. She was innocent. Every historian who has studied the documents, every scholar who has examined the evidence, agrees on this one fact. Lady Jane Grey never wanted the throne. She was a pawn in a game played by men who saw power as worth any price, even the life of a teenage girl. So why does her story matter 500 years later? Because what they did to Jane reveals something fundamental about power. How it uses people, how it discards them, and how the cruelest torture isn't always physical. Sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone is give them hope. Then, slowly, methodically, take it away. If you've ever wondered what it's like to watch your entire world collapse while powerful people decide your fate, you're about to find out. Here on this channel, we dig into the historical records that others overlook. Letters from the Tower of London, confession transcripts discovered in the British National Archives, eyewitness accounts buried for centuries. Every view, every subscription helps us uncover one more voice that history tried to silence. Now, let's go back to that cell, because the clock is ticking, and Jane Grey is about to learn that innocence means nothing when ambition writes the rules. To understand what happened to Jane, you need to understand who she was before the crown destroyed her. She wasn't born to be queen. She was born to be a scholar. By age 9, Jane spoke Latin, Greek, French, and Italian fluently. While other noble children played, she read Plato in the original Greek. She studied theology, philosophy, and history with tutors who marveled at her intellect. One of them, Roger Ascham, wrote that she possessed learning beyond her years and a soul that sought truth above all else. Her parents saw her brilliance not as a gift, but as a tool. Lady Frances Grey and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, were obsessed with royal connections. They beat Jane when she failed to show proper deference, locked her in her chambers when she questioned their decisions, and reminded her daily that her only value lay in who she could be married to. Jane once confided to her tutor that time spent with her books was the only time she felt free. The only time the chains of expectation loosened just enough to breathe. She never wanted power. She wanted peace. She never sought the throne. The throne was thrust upon her by men playing God with other people's lives. In May 1553, Edward VI, the boy king of England, lay dying of tuberculosis. He was 15 years old and terrified of what would happen to his Protestant kingdom if his Catholic half-sister Mary took the throne. Edward's chief minister, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, saw an opportunity. If Edward died and Mary became queen, Northumberland would lose everything: his power, his wealth, possibly his life. So he convinced the dying king to alter the succession, to bypass Mary and Elizabeth, his own half-sisters, and name Jane Grey as his heir. Why Jane? Because she was Protestant, because she was young and could be controlled, and because Northumberland had recently married his son, Guilford Dudley, to Jane, binding her to his family and his ambitions. Jane was 16 years old when they told her she was going to marry Guilford Dudley. She refused. Her parents beat her until she agreed. The wedding took place on May 21, 1553. Less than 2 months later, Edward VI died, and Jane's nightmare began. On July 9, 1553, they brought Jane to Sion House and told her she was now Queen of England. According to eyewitness accounts recorded by the Italian merchant Baptista Spinola, Jane collapsed. She wept. She begged them to choose someone else. "I am not fit for this," she said, her voice breaking. "I never sought this. Please, I beg you, find another." But John Dudley didn't care about her tears. He cared about control. And so Jane Grey, a girl who wanted nothing more than to read her books in peace, became Queen of England against her will. Her reign lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor, rightful heir by blood and by the will of Henry VIII, raised an army. The people of England, Catholic and Protestant alike, rallied to her cause. Not because they loved Mary, but because they recognized treason when they saw it. Jane had been used, manipulated, and thrust onto a throne she never wanted, and now she would pay the price. On July 19, 1553, Mary's forces entered London. John Dudley fled. Guilford Dudley was arrested. And Jane, alone in the Tower of London, realized that the men who had put her on the throne had abandoned her the moment it became inconvenient. That was the first cruelty, not the arrest, not the imprisonment, the abandonment, the realization that she had been nothing more than a tool, and now that the tool had broken, no one cared what happened to her. If this story doesn't disturb you yet, just wait, because what comes next is where the real torture begins. When Jane was arrested on July 19th, she was told she would be held temporarily while the new queen decided her fate. Temporarily. That word must have echoed in her mind during the 77 days she spent in the tower. Because as the days turned to weeks and the weeks turned to months, it became clear that nothing about her imprisonment was temporary. She was held in a small chamber in the gentleman gaoler's lodgings. Not a dungeon, but not a palace either. A room with stone walls, a narrow bed, a desk and a window that looked out onto Tower Green, the very place where Anne Boleyn had been executed 17 years earlier. Every morning, Jane woke and looked out that window, and every morning, she saw the scaffold. They didn't build it for her, not yet, but it was there, waiting, a constant reminder that her life hung by a thread that could be cut at any moment. Her captors allowed her books, paper, and a Bible, small mercies that felt like cruelty in disguise, because they gave her time to think, time to reflect on how she had been used, time to write letters begging for mercy that no one would answer. One of those letters, preserved in the British National Archives, was addressed to Mary herself. In it, Jane wrote, "I never desired the crown. I was placed upon the throne by those who sought their own gain, not the good of the realm. I beg your majesty to show mercy, not for my sake, but for the sake of justice." The letter was never answered. Instead, the silence grew heavier. Days passed with no word, no trial, no verdict, just waiting. And here's what makes it unbearable. They gave her hope. Mary's advisors debated for weeks whether to execute Jane. Some argued she was too young, too innocent, too obviously a pawn to deserve death. Others, led by Simon Renard, the Spanish ambassador, insisted that as long as Jane lived, she would remain a threat, a figurehead for Protestant rebels, a symbol that could ignite another uprising. Mary hesitated. According to letters from Renard, discovered in Spanish state archives, Mary initially wanted to spare Jane. She saw her as a victim of John Dudley's ambition. She even sent a priest to Jane's cell, offering to commute her sentence to life imprisonment if Jane would convert to Catholicism. Jane refused, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because the one thing she had left, the one thing no one could take from her, was her faith. "I cannot deny my God to save my life," she told the priest. "If I must die for my beliefs, then I will die with my soul intact." That refusal sealed her fate, but they didn't tell her immediately. They let her sit in that cell, not knowing whether she would live or die for weeks. And every day, she looked out that window at the scaffold and wondered if today would be the day they came for her. Think about that for a moment. 77 days of not knowing. 77 mornings waking up and wondering if this is the day they kill you. 77 nights lying awake, listening to footsteps in the corridor, praying they pass your door. That's not imprisonment. That's psychological torture. And it gets worse. In early November, Jane's husband, Guilford Dudley, was also imprisoned in the tower. They were held in separate chambers, but close enough that Jane could sometimes hear his voice echoing through the stone walls. Guilford was not a kind husband. He had been thrust into the marriage just as Jane had been thrust onto the throne. But he was young, only 19, and terrified. And in the long, silent nights of the tower, he reached out to Jane, asking if they could see each other, if they could take comfort in companionship during their final days. Jane refused, not out of cruelty, but because she knew that seeing him would make everything harder. Emotions, she believed, weakened resolve, and if she was going to die, she needed to die strong. On November 13, 53, Jane and Guilford were formally charged with high treason. The trial was held at Guilford Hall. Jane was brought before a panel of judges who had already decided her fate. The verdict was delivered within hours. Guilty. Sentence. Death by beheading. When they told her, Jane didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply nodded, as if some part of her had known all along that this was how it would end. But even then, they didn't execute her immediately. They sent her back to the tower and let her wait. Another 2 months. 2 more months of waking up each day and wondering if it would be her last. 2 more months of looking out that window at the scaffold. 2 more months of silence. And here's the cruelty that history often overlooks. Mary still hadn't signed the death warrant. Jane could have been spared. Even after the trial, even after the guilty verdict, execution was not inevitable. But then, in January 1554, a Protestant uprising led by Thomas Wyatt tried to overthrow Mary and place Jane's sister Catherine on the throne. The rebellion failed, but it convinced Mary's advisors that as long as Jane lived, she would be a rallying point for rebellion. Simon Ranard wrote to Mary, urging immediate action. The Lady Jane must die, not for what she has done, but for what others might do in her name. On February 7, 1554, 77 days after her arrest, Mary signed the death warrant. Jane Grey would be executed within the week. They told her on February 9th. Jane received the news calmly. She asked only one thing, that she be allowed to die privately within the tower grounds, rather than on Tower Hill where crowds gathered to watch executions. The request was granted. Small mercy. On the morning of February 12th, 1554, Jane woke before dawn. She dressed carefully in a black gown, a color of mourning. She pinned her hair up, exposing her neck, making the executioner's job easier. She wrote one final letter to her father, who had been complicit in her downfall, blaming him for nothing, forgiving everything. At 9 in the morning, they came for her. Outside her window, on Tower Green, the scaffold had been prepared. A wooden platform, a block, an axe. But before they took her there, Jane did something that stunned her captors. She asked to see her husband one last time, not to say goodbye, but to watch him die. Guilford Dudley was executed first, on Tower Hill, in front of a public crowd. His body was brought back to the tower on a cart, blood still dripping from the severed neck. Jane stood at her window and watched the cart pass beneath her. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply watched. And when the cart disappeared from view, she turned to her attendants and said, "I am ready." They led her across the courtyard to the scaffold. A small crowd had gathered. Guards, nobles, witnesses required by law. Jane climbed the steps. She stood before the block. She addressed the crowd, her voice steady. "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. My offense against the Queen's Highness was only in consent to the device of others, which now is deemed treason. But I do wash my hands in innocence before God and the face of you all. I pray you bear witness that I die a true Christian woman, and that I look to be saved by no other means but only by the mercy of God. Then she knelt. The executioner asked for her forgiveness. As was custom, she gave it. She tied a blindfold over her eyes. And then, in the final, most heartbreaking moment of her short life, Jane reached forward, searching for the block. Blinded, disoriented, she couldn't find it. Her hands groped the empty air. "What shall I do?" she whispered. "Where is it?" A witness standing nearby had to guide her hands to the wood. Jane laid her head down. She whispered a final prayer. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell. Lady Jane Grey was 17 years old. She had been queen for 9 days and a prisoner for 77. And in those 77 days, they had taken everything from her. Her freedom, her hope, her future. Everything except her faith. That they could never touch. So why does this story haunt us 5 centuries later? Because Jane Grey's tragedy wasn't just about power. It was about innocence destroyed by ambition. It was about a girl who never wanted to be queen, never sought the throne, and died because powerful men played games with her life. The scaffold was dismantled hours after her death. The blood was washed away. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave inside the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the tower walls. For centuries, no one knew exactly where she lay. It wasn't until 1876, during restoration work, that her remains were discovered and identified. By then, she had been forgotten by all but a few historians. But here's what they couldn't erase: her words, her letters, her final speech on the scaffold. These survived. And in them, we hear the voice of a girl who refused to be broken, even when everything was taken from her. In the British Library, you can still read the letter Jane wrote to her sister Catherine on the morning of her execution. In it, she wrote, "Live still to die, that by death you may purchase eternal life. As touching my death, rejoice as I do, and consider that I shall be delivered from corruption and put on incorruption." Jane Grey died with dignity, with faith, with grace. And that, more than anything, is why her story will haunt you forever. Because she was 17 years old, and they killed her for a crime she didn't commit. You've just witnessed one of history's darkest injustices. If stories like this remind you how fragile innocence is, how easily power can destroy the defenseless, then subscribe and help keep these voices alive. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, especially the ones that history tried to erase. Lady Jane Grey was meant to disappear. A footnote, a mistake. A girl whose name would fade with time. But she didn't disappear. She's still here. In the letters she wrote, in the scaffold speech that echoed through the tower, in the quiet courage of a 17-year-old girl who chose faith over survival. And now she's here with you, because you listened, because you remembered, because you refused to let her silence be the final word.